Chapter 4. A Robbery. Dark sat up as a drop of water splashed onto his head, cold and alone again. Guilty panic took hold of him anew. What if his mum had been trying to phone with news? He hurried to the upper fields where he could see some bars of signal. He stood waiting for missed call messages to appear. None did. That was good. He didn't want messages from the hospital. The hours reappeared on his screen. 05:31:21 a.m. Then he remembered the task he had set himself for later that day. He walked the rest of the way slowly. It was not a task he would want the old man or Matha to know about, not to mention his mam, breaking and entering. Possibly robbing something. Him, Arthur McLean, who had never really broken the law except for the occasional misdemeanour, accidentally catching a salmon on a pike spinner like Connie had taught him. A couple of cracked downloads from peer-to-peer sites, and the driving, which was mostly on back roads. The why and how of his plan were still absent. All he was certain of now was that he was going to do it. It didn't need any more thinking about than that. That was how things worked best with Dark. Kevin thought he had no fear. That wasn't it. It was just that he sometimes put his head down and headed straight towards the thing that scared him. Why could he not be like that with the hospital? He was asleep in Connie's lazy boy when his mum phoned. It was about 8 in the morning. "Art," she said distractedly, "I've arranged for Brian to milk the cows and then drive you down here." "No need, I'm almost halfway through the milking," he lied. "How is he today?" "Are you really? Well, Brian can bring you down here when you're finished." "That's all right," Dark said. "I have another thing to do later, a geography project I need to have finished." "You doing a school project in the holidays? For feck's sake, Arthur," she said, a scratchiness in her voice. She only ever swore when she was really fed up with them. "You're avoiding coming down, and you're lying about it. That means you're up to something dodgy again, doesn't it? I'm warning you, Arthur, I don't have the bandwidth for getting in shit now." Bad excuse. Dark's mum might not have known quite how occasional Dark's relationship with school was these days, but she knew enough to realise that it was no school project that was keeping him away from Connie's bedside. "Did you ask them to take a look at the bite marks?" he asked, to change the subject. "Arthur, that's the third bloody time you've reminded me to ask them about the marks." "Is he any better?" "At least he's not worse," she said, the anger gone again. "But he's not eating, so that's not too great." "Okay, ma'am, that's cool." Dark wasn't listening. He didn't want to hear. "I'd better keep the cows moving. Talk later." Dark did not find the feeling in his stomach was getting any better. Maybe the lack of sleep was making him confused. He went out to work. It was a trick he had learned long ago. When thinking about things was filling him with dread, doing things was the best way to make the feeling go into the background. He set to mixing calf milk and then rounding up the cows. He put fence posts and nylon reels in the transport box and went off in the tractor to look for fencing that needed attention. When it was time, he put on his hoodie and jacket. He pumped his bike. He locked the dogs inside and headed for town. It was 7 miles. Even though he knew every bump and bend from his daily cycle to school, today it felt like the road was much longer than usual. Like he was going backwards. He cycled harder. Any sane person would know that the only chance for Connie was in medicine, and that Dark should have been down there in Cork to be sat at his side. Connie would want to see him. Instead, he was retreating. In truth, he was just bewildered and out of his depth, but stubbornness wouldn't let him turn around. He promised himself that if he got through this mission, he would go get a lift to the city this evening, and he would go into the hospital, and he would put his hand on his uncle's head and will him to get better. If he got through this mission. When he got to the petrol station, he first spotted the worried figure of Kevin. Homepage was what they called him in school because the round glasses and floppy hair made him look like a Google Doodle, and because he knew everything. Dark remembered that he was still his most reliable friend. He could always depend on him. Then he saw that Kevin wasn't alone, and he cursed him under his breath for his unreliability. Next to him was Kira. She seemed older in jeans and jumper. Her jet black hair was tied back, and she had shiny red studs in her ears. He felt a wave of reddening in his face. He didn't want to meet her under these circumstances. He went over to them. She smiled, and her green eyes seemed to be waiting for him to say something to her. She sort of turned up her palm to give him a small wave. "So you wanted to hang out?" asked Kevin. Dark shrugged. He had intended telling Kevin that he was needing a lookout while he did some graffiti on the back wall of the Emporium. That he needed a 3-ring warning on the phone if Salty appears. That was all he wanted from Kevin. But now it was too complicated. Kira wouldn't put up with just hanging around at the garage without asking questions that Kevin would not ask. She would think he was dodgy, maybe a vandal, or a robber even. "Well, you called us. Do you want to go into town, or go sit in the park, or what?" Kevin asked. "Us. I called you," said Dark, only realising how that sounded when she stepped away. "I mean, it was nothing. You guys go ahead. I'll catch up with you later, maybe." "If you don't mind me saying so, isn't that a bit rude?" said Kevin. "Why did you tell me to meet you here?" "Just because," said Dark as they walked away. She looked over her shoulder at him, and he knew she was thinking he was odd. It didn't seem very fair. Most people in school still lived their lives like he had once lived his, back when it was him and his dad and his mum in their very nice house in the city. Back when he used to have takeaway every Thursday, movies every Friday, football or the mall with his friends every Saturday, restaurant lunch every Sunday. He had a BB gun, 2 games consoles, and a prize collection of Marvel superhero original editions. Every day and every year just fell into place without him having to think about it once. For 4 years since, no day had seemed to fall quite into place for him or his mum. And then, just when things had started to go better, all this. And here he was, thinking how to climb a 10-foot wall at the back of a grey terrace in a nowhere town, while normal people went off to try stuff in the game shops and have a bant in the park. Dark fixed his gaze on the noble weed across the road. He remembered the radio interview after the Tomahawk incident. Shanto from NWLR asked, "Trev, you have such success with the Emporium. Why did you need to court controversy with, this head shop revival thing?" Salty had answered so honestly that Shanto had laughed, thinking he was joking. "When I see a pigeon along the way, I pluck it." Painted in gold lettering on plate glass. "Healthy minds, find your nirvana, salvia, the divine sage, reach your herbally higher plane." How would he even begin to know what he was looking for in there? He again deferred that thought. He had set himself a job and he would do it. He waited till he saw Salty stick his head out, looked up and down the street, and then emerge in his white shirt, which he always wore open, and with the sleeves rolled up even on really cold evenings like this one. He was sporting a hipster goatee and tight jeans, for both of which he was too old. His shoes were a light tan colour like his skin. He was carrying a cash box. He locked the door and stepped into his red pickup truck, which Dark hadn't noticed parked in the side alley. When the pickup disappeared onto the ring road, Dark assumed that the coast was clear. He crossed the road quickly with his parka hood pulled up. He headed into the alley. Nobody saw him, he was pretty sure. Conveniently, there was a rotting pallet at the end of the lane. He propped that up against the wall to give himself a precarious leg up. With his arm over the top, he quickly pulled himself over and dropped down onto the other side. Suddenly, the name of the shop repeating in his head was sounding nothing like Connie muttered words. This was all wrong, but the Red had confirmed it, hadn't he? The Red would know. Then he thought of Connie. No turning back now. He was in a concreted yard, unnaturally neat, just like Salty's farmyard. His mother called him Arthur, the sometimes sensible one. This was not very sensible. not even by comparison with Connie. Against the back wall there were plastic pallets with KE shipping labels, and boxes filled with stone ornaments, garden elves and the like. Along the side wall was a row of identical old-style lampposts and imitation water pumps, all with cast-iron vines and fat baby-faced fairies crawling up them. Distracted by this, Dark crossed the yard to a back window of the shop without noticing the open door of the shed in the corner which backed onto the rear of Kaiser's Emporium, and without hearing sounds of two men working within it. As he tried a window, he saw it had magnetic sensors at the sides. Alarmed, of course. Even if he could prise it open, it was pointless. He was turning back to the wall in some relief when he noticed the other window was slightly open. It was releasing faint smells, something like those which came from a chemistry lab in school, but that meant the alarm was off. He didn't delay further. He couldn't afford to. He slid the window fully up and climbed in. Inside the shadowy shop, he finally faced the fact that this was the maddest thing in his mad life. He had no idea as to what he was doing here. He felt caged. He looked all around, desperate to see something that made any sense. Hanging on the walls there were all kinds of bongs. In glass cabinets, there were rows of plastic bottles with leafy labels. One cabinet was labelled health supplements, another aromatherapy oils. The cabinet at the back wall held bodybuilding supplements, and the one behind the counter had a label over it that said the good stuff. Inside it were glass jars with desiccated leaves, mushrooms, bits of bark, and pieces of what looked like rabbit's feet. It wasn't anything like he expected. What was before him was more like an array of African potions than he'd seen on YouTube videos about a witch doctor. A nauseous sensation crept over him. He thought he could hear distant drums. He looked down and saw he was standing on an animal pelt. Maybe a goat or a springbok. It felt alive, watching him. He was ready to grab at just about anything to justify his trip and bolt back to daylight. Then his eye fell on a jar standing among a row of jars, each with a browning chestnut leaf inside. There was something different about this particular jar. It looked much older than the others, like it was hiding out in the open. He took it down. The glass top was airtight. He wrenched it off. In the fresh air, the leaf inside crumbled instantly to papery fragments. Dark wasn't sure what to do. Whenever he broke something as a child, he would hide it until he could figure out how to fix it or find the right time to tell his mum. So it may have been out of instinct that he poured the leaf crumbs into his inner pocket, the hold for many things he had yet to decide about. He stepped back and stood on something that rocked under his foot. As he bent to pick up a truncheon that Salty apparently felt he needed to keep behind the counter, the jar squeezed itself from his fingertips. Its shattering made a noise like a shout, and Dark was relieved at the break in the silence. Some seconds later, Dark became aware of a loud argument outside the open window. The crashing noise in the shop had apparently alerted Nighthawk security, that is, the two men who did bouncer duty at the Emporium, and in the daytime, it seemed, did odd jobs such as sorting salty merchandise in the adjoining back shed. He knew both voices. One, thick with ignorance, was that of Henry Hogg, who had been famous in Mullet for cross-country running until he took up bodybuilding. The other voice, which addressed Hogg as "oh boy," was that of a fat man called Johnson. Lads at school said that Johnson had fled Nigeria after eating his mother. Dark wasn't so sure about that, but he did not doubt that either of these men could do him serious damage if they caught him. Johnson was not happy about the instruction that he should go in first. He was saying, I don't trust the place. There could be something very dangerous in there making all that noise. In! That's an order, shouted Hogg. Get your fat arse in there. Dark felt the truncheon drop from his hand. The urge to continue using it had dried up as mysteriously as it had welled. He stepped through the mess of broken glass to the front door, wrestling the two locks open. Outside on the pavement was a short man, with a heavy moustache and a walking stick. He let Dark pass, but got in the way of Hogg and Johnson as they emerged, giving Dark a few metres. As Dark ran, the hood of his parka blew back. Hogg was yelling, "Stop you! Hey, lanky! I've seen you before. Come back here to me. I'm going to pulverise you." Dark was faster than them, and when he turned the next corner, the overgrown old graveyard at the top of Hill Street seemed like the best place to run for. He had spent a while there with Connie one Saturday, trying to read the partly eroded names and working out the lifespans of various ancestors. He wished Connie was here now. These two would not dare to come near him. Connie would know how to sort the whole thing. "A bit of a misunderstanding there, boys, that's all," or "no harm, no foul" would not sound so persuasive when it was coming out of Dark's mouth. In the graveyard there was only one place to go. The table stone over a Micheál. First initial disappeared, who had been left here since 1721. Dark remembered thinking on the day of the inspection that it would be a great place to hide, never imagining that he would have to actually climb under it someday. Changed circumstances. As he lay in the dark, barely breathing, he thought that phrase had been made just for him. Arthur McLean of the ever-changing circumstances. He gazed across through long grass at the men at the gate. He heard Hogg say, "Holy smoke," as he looked nervously about. He had a reputation for being religious and getting into vicious tempers about blasphemy. Last year he had beaten a lad queuing for the Emporium gig for saying, "Hogg, you look as gay as Jesus in your uniform." Johnson shrugged and said, "Henry, oh boy, it seems like the fellow has run for protection from his ancestors. I am not for coming between them." Hogg said, "I thought you people were Christian." "I'm just stating the obvious facts of the matter, that's all," said Johnson, with a deep round laugh. Hogg too seemed to be losing the will to proceed. Searching an overgrown graveyard at dusk might have seemed a bit more than the Nighthawks were paid for. "I've seen you somewhere before," he shouted. "It will come back to me later, and then the boss will come get you." Dark didn't doubt that Hogg would remember where he had seen him before. He wished Connie could have just steered clear of people like Hogg, as normal people do. Dark's mom said Connie was full of fatal attractions. A strange thing for her to say. Dark had been in the Queen Mary the day that Connie had pulled up outside the Emporium. Hogg was standing with his shoulders back and arms crossed over the new maroon Nighthawks uniform. He had surveyed them through the tortoise-shell Ray-Bans and signalled them to move on. Connie had rolled down the window and shouted, "Good Jesus, is it you, Henry? I thought it was Lady Gaga. Have the shite hawks beaten up many school kids this week?" A group of women had stopped on the street to laugh at Henry as he shook his fist at Connie from afar, not daring to come closer. Before retreating inside the Emporium, he had certainly seen Dark in the passenger seat. Soon he would remember. Then he would be able to tell Salty who it was who'd been breaking bottles and shelves in the shop. And then they'd have the man with the moustache of a witness. Dark was about to enter a whole new world of trouble. Hogg muttered something that Dark couldn't hear, and they left. If they had waited a minute longer, they'd have had him, because just then something beside him moved. Lying there in the blackness with the stone overhead almost touching his nose, he was sure it was a skull. And then he felt himself sinking in the bare, damp clay. Maybe his remaining senses were trying to escape him. Nighthawks or not, he bolted from his hide faster than a hare and vaulted the back wall of the graveyard without even checking what he would land on. A stony clump of nettles, as it happened. He realised he couldn't go back to the garage to get his bike. They might be hanging around on the street. He knew his way across the fields, out to the back road. Even with a possibly sprained ankle and nettle stings up to his knees, he ran on until he was back in Kill, on Maclean ground. He sat down exhausted in the hay shed. He knew that he was in over his head. Salty would have the Gardaí out interviewing him by tomorrow. He'd left fingerprints all over the place. Sergeant Curtin wouldn't be able to get him out on this one. And for all that, he had only the fragments of a leaf, of no imaginable use for Connie or anybody else. He could pack a bag tonight and leave altogether. Leave his mother, Connie, the farm and the whole mess and start his own life somewhere. He was big enough to pass himself off as an older guy, and he was sure he would get bar or restaurant work in Dublin or further away. Even as this thought settled him, he knew in his heart he was not going to do it. He knew that his mum and Connie thought they needed him around, no matter what kind of crap he had gotten himself into. Tomorrow could bring what it wanted. He really wanted to see them now. He called up the contact number that his mother had sent him for Brian. "Of course, son," said Brian. "Never hesitate to ask. I'll drop in to do the milking and whatever else you need done. You should know that most people around here would do anything for Con and his people." For the drive to Cork, Dark phoned the first person who came into his head. The Red said, "Any hour, any location, any problem, the Red is your only man." Maybe being on the open road with the Red would distract him from the fear of hospitals. Even before Dark had the calves and dogs fed, the enormous orange truck was in the yard. The Red walked around behind him, standing well back and giving useless advice about which calves could get more milk than which none. The Red didn't directly ask anything about how Connie was. But when they sat into the truck, he plugged out his MP3 player from the system for a minute and turned to Dark. "And tell me, have you it sorted out yet, this thing with the big fella?" If such a strange question had come from a regular person, Dark might have dwelt on it more. But he knew there was no point with the Red. There was not even any point in complaining about the bad advice to rob the shop. The Red would just deny having ever heard of such a thing. Besides, it wasn't as though Connie had not warned him often enough never to listen to anything Red had said. Dark looked down at Georgina going on her circular prowl. The Red didn't wait long for an answer. The music, 70s disco, came back on full blast. The trailerless Mack revved up to the max and spun gravel in every direction as it headed out for the road. Hitting every corner and not slowing for any pothole, it was beyond Dark's comprehension how this truck always looked new. Out on the main road, the Red amused himself with high-speed tailgating two guys in a BMW who he claimed had cut in front of him. Eventually the BMW driver lost his nerve and pulled over. "Yeah, that's right, fool," whined the Red into a CB mic he had rigged to a loud hailer on the roof. "Get that piece of crap off my highway." In the hospital, Dark was shocked by the scene in the wards. His mum was sitting in a chair next to the bed, looking washed out. She didn't even comment on him getting a lift with the Red, with whom she'd forbidden him to ever taking a ride. She stood and hugged him. That wasn't her way. Connie was propped, half-sitting. His face was sunken and pale. He moved his eyes rather than his head to look towards them, and barely nodded. The Red got bored and moved to the other side of the room to lie on the bed opposite. He yawned and went immediately to sleep. Dark found himself trying to fill the silence. "I managed to milk the mad heifer with her kicking the clusters off only twice," he said. "The mental calves have started eating nuts. Oh, and by the way, the diesel tank is empty. We're getting empty." He was telling everything except the most important bit of information, that he might be getting arrested tomorrow. They were both looking at him. He never babbled. They probably put it down to a reaction of some kind. His mum was called by a nurse, and Connie signalled that he wanted Dark to come closer. There it came again, Connie saying, "Talta Lanmarie Noblady. Lanmarie is Moira Fada." Dark tried quietly, out of the hearing of the others. Connie's face brightened for an instant as he nodded. "And noble lady is the noble weed." The head shook and Dark's heart sank. His mum came back saying the medical team were on their way. They were running late with their evening round. The group entered, all in white coats except the man in front, who looked like he was on his way to a dinner party. When the lead man glanced with an eyebrow raised at the Red, a nurse stared at Dark, expecting an explanation. Dark shrugged. The nurse went over and shook him, saying, "Good God, you could at least have taken off your boots. What kind of man are you at all?" Everyone is always down on the little man, he snarled. They stepped back from him. I am at least as sick as that big galoot. And no medicine at all for me? How do you explain that? He started coughing as though he was going to vomit and then limped into the bathroom. A couple of them nodded at Dark's mum. Are you the family? We are sending him home, said the man in charge. But he can't speak, said Dark's mother, shocked into short sentences. Have you even found out what it is? He can sit up now, though. We have run every test, said the doctor, glancing at his watch and adjusting his dicky bow. I'm convinced that he'll recuperate better at home. He's not even eating, and surely you can see that he's in terrible pain, said Dark's mother with panic in her voice, her hand holding Connie's. Look, to be brutally frank, there's nothing physically wrong with him, said the doctor. So it's out of my jurisdiction, so to speak. You sometimes get these things. Psychosomatic disturbances, we call them. And the pain, asked Dark, finding his courage, is that psychosomatic too? Chronic pain, we call it, young man, said the doctor, who looked like the youngest adult in the room. It sometimes settles in, almost like a burglar alarm that can't be switched off. We'll give you something to ease him when it gets bad. But he can't even speak, said Dark's mum again, looking tearfully at the grave face that had always been hearty and laughing. Was the big fella much of a talker before? Maybe this is all too much for him here in the big hospital. Turning to Connie, he said loudly in his Montenotte accent, as though Connie was deaf or stupid. You're a farmer, they tell me, Cornelius. Good for you. I envy you. Maybe you'll find your voice when you're back among the tractors and cows and things, eh? Did you check the bite? I thought maybe he could have Weil's disease or something, Dark asked. Maybe the tension of being in the hospital and of how the doctor was talking to Connie came across in his voice. He hadn't meant it to sound hostile. The bite? Anger flashed across the doctor's face. He laughed sarcastically. Weil's disease? We have an internet connection then, I take it. You know, while we appreciate your medical insights, your mother did relay your convictions regarding the mythical bite several times. That was a strange way to describe the bite, Dark thought. Besides, at most, he'd asked his mum to ask the nurses 3 or maybe 4 times. The thing is, though, I can assure you we would have seen a bite, continued the doctor. It's the kind of thing one might tend to notice after a decade of studying medicine. There was a pause. Another doctor in the group, a woman with long red hair and a stern mouth, seemed embarrassed. Then the consultant's tone changed. He was done with them. And now I'm really sorry, but that's all I can do for you. He is stable, and I'm sure he'll improve at home, and if he doesn't, you shouldn't hesitate to bring him back to A&E, and, well, of course, we'll see what we can do for him. Good day. The red-haired woman came back to them after the others had left and said, sorry, he's just very overworked. We did test for Weil's and several other pest-borne and tropical diseases, by the way. The ambulance will bring you home. Here, call me direct if you have any other ideas. She offered a corner, torn from her handbook, with her name and numbers scribbled on it. For some reason, she seemed to be offering it to Dark. Okay? Dark looked at it. Leah Cannon. 2 hours later, the ambulance men brought Connie into the kitchen in a wheelchair. Before leaving, they helped the Red, Dark, and his mum move him into Dark's bed in the only downstairs bedroom. Dark would sleep upstairs in Con's room. After the Red had finished drinking his tea and shaking his head in what looked like disapproval at the unrecognisable shell of a man who had made everything all right and everyone welcome in Kill, he left. Dark said he'd sit up with Connie a while, trying him with a spoon of custard every so often. His mum was so exhausted she couldn't protest. After she had been upstairs for an hour or so, all the walking around, the sound of her footsteps stopped. Then Dark said to Connie, should I move the things from the tractor shed in case Salty has figured out where they are? Connie shook his head. Dark already knew Connie's thinking on this. The disturbance would be more likely to draw attention. But he was asking anyway. He really wanted to tell Connie he was in trouble. but he didn't think he'd be able to bear that, him not being able to do anything to help. Instead, he said, "I've been back." Sweating and pale as paper, Connie nodded slightly. That was strange. Connie had been adamant that he should end contact with the rat after the last time. "Maybe I should go back again tonight?" he said. Connie nodded again. Or did he? But he made a sound that Dark decided was good. In truth, it might have been anything. Connie's voice was gone from the air, leaving him directionless. Dark waited a while longer, to be sure his mam was sound asleep. Then he got his jacket and wellies on, and headed out in the rain. As he dragged through the bog air in the dark, every step sank deeper than the last. Even though he was now expert at picking out the tufts of reed that offered firmer ground, inches of rain had fallen since last night, and there was no sign of let-up. His jacket was soaked by the time he had reached the rat. More rainwater was leaking from the saturated canopy, but it stopped once the fire appears. "Come in and warm yourself," said the old man, "and lighten your load." "Thanks," said Dark to Attain, when she produced the chalice. "Now, what was it going on about?" asked the old man. "Moira father," said Dark, more boldly. "I still don't know how to—" "Whisht! Shh!" said the old man, putting an arm over Dark's shoulder. "That'll all come to you." And then he started again. A terrifying feeling of rising bog waters engulfed Dark.